Delacquin, Westphal, Bidiotes comic, Will Mali Nagawasis, Wali Gunaganami Quasit, Zagel
A question stares back at us from the Christmas crib tonight. And the question is this. Let's put it in personal terms. What do you and I hope for? Substitute the word dream. What do you and I dream for? What is our dream hope for the future? Now, whatever else Christmas means to you, it will have new meaning if it leads us into new hope. And so, go gently into this night and take care, each of you, not to tread on someone else's dreams or hope. And I pray for you a Christmas filled with new hope.
The peace of the Lord be always with you.
And also with you.
Peace. Peace of mind. Peace. Peace was lost. I didn't know from day to day if I was going to live or die. Well, I come from a broken home. They sent us to my grandmother's, but my brothers and I were so hyper from all the abuse. She couldn't cope with our personalities. We were too wild. And so she ended up suggesting that we go to Indian residential school.
I want to talk about racism, about how deeply racism is embedded in white America, and how it continues to kill Native Americans and Native American culture today. As a white man, I feel strange saying this. How can this be? Why should any of us think that we take part in this racism, if it exists at all? It's something from the past. If we haven't said it ourselves, we've heard others say, "Oh yes, it was terrible." But we're not like that now. But racism toward Native people continues today. And if we don't see it, maybe that's because we don't want to. And if we don't want to see it, how will we ever confront and change it? How will we ever free ourselves of racism? Let's start with a few stories. Stories about taking Native children from their families and their tribes. Beginning in the late 1800s, countless Native American children were sent to residential schools throughout the United States and Canada. Often these children were carried to schools hundreds or even thousands of miles from their families. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, were among the most widely known. some Indian schools stayed open until the late 1960s. One of them was the Indian Residential School in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia. Gloria Knockwood was sent there at the age of 8.
So that's where I went, my brothers and I. And my brothers were my world. They were my life. And not being able to see them after all that, like losing my parents, not having a home. No, we weren't allowed to see them. At mealtime, our tables were in one big room, and the center was a nun. And if you were caught looking at your brother, you got in trouble. Well, first they'd announce, well, I just saw Gloria Knockwood. I saw you looking at your brother. They'd either do something mean to my brother, or they would punish me somehow by taking away something like food, leaving the room, or one of the worst things to me, to all of us, was being stood up in the middle of the whole room with the boys looking at you. That was more shaming than getting hit. I remember a situation in particular where Sister Gilberta, she was reprimanding me about something. She was hollering at me, and I looked at her. She says, "Don't you look at me." So I looked down, and she says, "Look at me when I'm talking to you." So she kept doing that. And I thought, I remember standing there doing what she said, and I felt like real creepy. The whole thing was so insane. But I had to do it, or she had a big stick in her hand. She would hit me. There was all kinds of physical abuse. Almost everything you did, the consequence would be abusive. That we were less than. That was the basic message. That we were less than. Being dark wasn't good. Being white was good. Or being light was good. The browner the person, the more like subhuman they were. Sometimes when they got mad, they would call us savages. No, they didn't want to speak in Mi'kmaq. And some of the girls that came in couldn't speak English. And boy, did they ever get it. Beatings, real bad beatings. That was the part that was weird. I mean, common sense would tell you, even I knew, I was just a kid, even I knew that took time. They couldn't come in like Monday and speak English Tuesday. That was impossible. So it didn't make any sense. They were de-Indianizing us. That's what was going on. They were trying to change us. They did change us. I don't think I can describe the fear. It was a real horrible fear because I was little and I had no power. I knew I could not do anything about it, and I didn't know how to make it stop. And I kept thinking that it was my fault, that I had done something wrong. I was so scared. I thought I was going to get killed. That's what I really thought. I thought we were going to get killed. I knew it would end. All I had to do was like march, that there was an ending. And that's what kept me going. If I hadn't had that, I don't know what I would have done. I remember when I got done with school, like I had been told what to do by the Indian agent, by the nuns. Everybody had control of my life all my life. And all of a sudden I was 18 and done with my education. I was done with everything. And I felt the oddest feeling in the world. I didn't know what to do at all. I had no idea what to do.
I was afraid of my own shadow when I left the Indian residential school, and I was a nervous wreck, and I used to chew my nails, and I never spoke. I was afraid, like I said.
Isabel Knockwood also went to the Indian residential school. She entered in the mid-1930s, only a few years after it opened. She started at the age of 5, a year younger than most, because her sister was going into the school and her family wanted the two girls to keep each other company. One of her brothers was already in the school. All residential school pupils spent long hours at labor. Some children worked in the kitchen. Others were hired out to local farmers to generate income for the school. Isabel worked in the laundry.
It was terribly dangerous. We had no instructions, no safety. We wore no safety gear. We were just taken right from the breakfast, right from our breakfast, and taken to the laundry and to work these big machines. And of course there was this big mangle, this monstrosity of a mangle, that we ironed out the sheets, and a lot of children got their hands caught in the rollers, the hot rollers. It was terrible. For life, maimed for life. Yeah. The hardest thing is not being able to help my brother when he was beaten. Somebody was always being beaten because they didn't understand the transmission of the English. They didn't understand the transmission of the information from one language to another. Well, I survived by what I call learning how to be invisible in plain sight. You keep quiet, you don't speak up, you don't complain, you don't draw attention to yourself. You do whatever you're told, no matter how unreasonable it is, such as when a child gets beaten, you're not allowed to go over and help them, which was directly opposite to what my mother had taught me. And that's how I survived. And lots of times I had to compromise myself, my teachings. Like your identity is attacked, who you were, and you don't know who you were. And who are you? Are you Mi'kmaq? You can't speak it. And when we would come home, the elders would ask us something in Mi'kmaq, and then we'd answer in English, and the elders would say, well, what kind of Indian are you? You can't even speak your own language.
The effects of keeping children from speaking their own language go deeper than just forcing them to learn a new one. If you destroy a people's language, you destroy their culture. And residential schools destroyed native languages.
If you study the evolution of language, you can study the evolution of the people, the cultural evolution. And the language holds the secrets of our development, our cultural development. Yeah, it was, the funny thing happened to me is that I understand it, everything, but I can't say it. And I think the reason why is because of so much pinching. Like you draw back and you know, the pain is still there. You know, you still remember it.
Carol Pulches got into trouble with the Maine Department of Human Services when her 14-year-old daughter Jessie was bitten in the face by a dog. Desperate to get help for her girl, she called on the nearest person, a convicted sex offender, to drive them both to the hospital. Jessie sat in her mother's lap on the way, and the friend dropped them off and left.
It's like, well, it comes down to it, my daughter's standing there bleeding to death, or who I'm getting a ride to the hospital with. I'm taking a ride. I don't care. It isn't like I put her in the truck.
20 days later, a DHS worker accompanied by the police arrived at Carol's home to take Jessie and her 13-year-old sister from their mother. The reason, she was told, was failure to protect. Maliseet Chief Brenda Commander was nearby.
Well, we looked over. We could see right across the street. There was 2 town policemen, a state trooper, the supervisor of DHHS, and 2 caseworkers, all in the yard. So I walked into the house, and the mother was screaming at the DHS supervisor, and the supervisor was trying to give her a court emergency order from the judge. I looked at the paper, wasn't dated, and was not signed by a judge. So I went over to the officers, and everybody was just kind of standing around on the lawn, and I said, I'm going to have to ask you all to leave.
Fearing that her daughters would be taken, later that night Carol had a tribal elder carry them across the border into Canada to stay with an uncle. There she felt they would be safe.
They told us we'd be back before Christmas, within 10 days if we turned ourselves in. So we came across the border, and we, by our own free will, me and my sister turned ourselves in. And that's where we got in with DHS. From there, they moved us to the crisis center in Caribou. They said they wouldn't separate me and my sister because we've never been separated. And 15 days later, I went to Presque Isle and she went to Ashland. The night before we were separated, my sister climbed in bed with me. And she was crying, and she said, "We fought before," she says, "but I love you and I don't want you to leave." So, and we got separated the day after.
I think it made him grow up fast. I know it took a toll on both the girls.
Yeah, well, my mother had to go to evaluation, and when she came back and they had evaluated us, they told her that our family had a personal enmeshment, and that meant that our family was so close that they'd do anything to be together, you know.
By the next spring, Carol still had not gotten her children back. It seemed that, though she worked hard to comply with DHS requirements, the case kept getting extended. She did not know why. Time stretched out till Christmas was approaching again. Then suddenly, a year after they took custody of the 2 girls, DHS released them and dismissed the case against Carol. They have never explained their actions.
Yes, my mother's been there through the whole thing. Even if we were 200 miles away, she was there. We were in harm's way more in DHS care than we were with my mother. Like, yeah, she can't leave her daughter to bleed to death from a dog bite to the face. And if it was me too, I'd take that ride.
I am the Indian Child Welfare Coordinator and work with DHS to assist families and children that they have in care or that they're working with. From the experience that I've had, the department has overreacted and will do removals or go into homes on minor things when in Native homes, if relatives are coming through the area and they need a place to stay, then Native people will open their homes up and allow those people to stay with them. And many times DHS has looked at that as not being an okay thing.
I think that they felt like that they could do whatever they wanted and that they controlled the natives. I think that they looked upon natives as uneducated and not being able to defend what or speak out about what DHS was doing.
I believe that they will take the child first and then worry about the questions later. I was fostered into the what was then the Health and Human Services in 1951. My adopted parents, They were Scots and Irish Catholic. They were brought up in the church, St. Mary's. I went to St. Mary's parochial school and graduated through the 8th grade. And so as far as I was concerned, I thought I was Scots and Irish and part of the family. I had no idea. And it was supposed to be a, quote, temporary placement, but I ended up staying in that one home for 16 years for the remainder of my period with DHS. One of the things, I was around 12 years old, I remember when I was playing with some of the neighborhood kids, and one of them happened to be Indian. And she came over to me and she said, "Larry, don't play with those Indians. They drink, you know." And those Indians, that's where her ideal was at that point. I got a letter from the Department of Human Services, and I opened it and found out I was Native. And then all these thoughts came back to me about what my foster mother had said. Oh God, now I'm one of those people. For me, being fostered out of my Native lineage, like I said, is bittersweet at best. It saved my life, but it took my heritage.
All this raises a question. Why? Obviously, at times removing children from their homes really does protect them. But there seems to be more to it than that. Why would DHS be so quick to take Native children, especially in cases where there seems little evidence that they are in danger?
I feel that the reason for that would be to destroy the tribe, to eliminate the culture, eliminate the ways of Native people, and make everybody white.
But it's scary, and I think that, you know, for us it was like a critical impact, because if they were taking our kids, we weren't going to be a tribe. If we lost our kids, who was going to be running the tribe someday? There would be no one. Our tribe would be extinct.
Likewise, when we look at the residential school programs of the recent past, we see similar motives. These schools were not about education. They were about exterminating tribes. Many of the schools were run by the U.S. government, and many others were run by the churches, financed with federal money. All of them were part of the official policy of assimilation, a way to deal with what the government saw as the Indian problem. Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Carlisle School, had run an army prison camp for Native Americans after the Civil War. It was at this prison that he came up with the residential school idea. Pratt's motto was, "Kill the Indian and save the man." And residential schools kill the Indian by isolating these children, separating them from their families, and then destroying their connection to their heritage. Often physically and sexually abused, these children, if they did manage to return home at all, knew little of what they were returning to. At times, parents unwittingly signed over legal custody of their children when they enrolled them. This assured the schools control over these children if parents tried to get them back.
Residential schools were the ultimate violence in the sense that they not only, it was forcibly removing children, people who have suffered sexual and physical abuse at schools and in all kinds of situations. And those are the kinds of, incredible traumatic events that Native people and Native communities have to heal from.
Kids, when they had the chance, would run off. The kids, when they had a chance, would start speaking First Nations languages. So rather than education, the residential schools became like a juvenile prison system where the inmates were impressed labor in order to keep the schools functioning. There was a case that Maclean's magazine made a great deal of in 1965 where a Ojibwe Ojibwe fellow, young lad, Charlie Wenjack, tried to walk home from Thunder Bay, Ontario to Fort Albany. Well, that's on Hudson's Bay. Well, take a look at a map. He was trying to make, just short of a 1,000-mile journey in the dead of winter wearing a t-shirt and a pair of tennis shoes and jeans. And he was found frozen dead on the tracks. But you have to ask yourself, what would drive you to walk out in the dead of winter to try to walk 1,000 miles home, just following a railroad track further and further into the north? What was going on in that school that would say to you, well, I'm better off trying to walk home 1,000 miles than I am staying here? But you shouldn't limit these kinds of your considerations in this to the horror stories, and there are plenty of horror stories. It wasn't that every child got raped, or every child was starved, or every child was worked to the point of exhaustion. It was that what we take for granted as ordinary human beings was denied these children simply on the basis of who they were. What would have meant to you not to have seen your father or your mother except for a month or two every year at best, or to spend 12 years away from your mother and father? There were people who'd stayed in a residential school so long they never went home again.
Ultimately, you realize your lifestyle, your way of life has been stolen.
I have a great deal of respect for people who went through the residential school and are strong enough to say, as bad as it was, I don't want to forget this. The reason that everybody wants us to forget it is because it is still happening. It's just happening in a more subtle way. They don't need separate buildings to imprison us in anymore. And the American population doesn't understand the enormity of what they carried out in the residential schools and Indian policy in general. The fact of the matter is that the Canadian and the American government were taking children away from their parents and putting them under the control of somebody else. And that in itself is an act of genocide.
In 1946, the United Nations declared genocide a crime under international law. The UN defines genocide as acts intended to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. These acts can be direct, killing members of that group. But they can also be indirect, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting living conditions calculated to destroy the group, imposing measures to prevent births within the group, and, most damning here, forcibly moving children from one group to another. Residential schools and overzealous fostering clearly come within this definition. But what are the roots of genocide itself? Where does it come from? Behind genocide lies racism.
And racism, in its deepest, sort of most fundamental sense, is a desire to exclude anyone who is not like me.
Prejudice plus power is racism. So that one group of people has to have the power to be able to oppress another race of people.
I think people are programmed to be racist without a basis. The basis perhaps generated generations ago, and now it's just happening without a reason. Folks are just kind of programmed to be that way, and they really don't need an incident or any kind of a reason to be that way.
You know, it isn't like it doesn't touch everybody. Racism, we are all victims of racism because most of us never intended to have racist thoughts. You know, we don't grow up like that. We don't grow up wanting to know stereotypes.
So I think that when we really look at racism, we should keep the focus on the larger reasons for the racism.
The kind of racism that we're talking about today is born in 1492, because not only does Columbus have to deny the humanity of the people whose property he's about to steal, he finds that they don't take very well to being enslaved. If you show up and find that there are a bunch of people inhabiting land that you want, it's not terra nullius, then you have a problem. The problem is that if these are people here, then they have rights under your own laws. They have right to be treated as sovereign nations and so on. But if you can deny their humanity, then suddenly, you know, you don't sign treaties with moose. You don't sign treaties with squirrels. If we can treat these people who are obviously people as if they weren't people. If we can dehumanize them, we can treat them the same way that we treat mosquitoes or other kind of vermin that we find infesting the territory we want. So the genocide of First Nations people stems more from a political and economic necessity of how we're going to enrich ourselves. It's by impoverishing other human beings. How do we do that and still look at ourselves in the mirror, still consider ourselves good Christians or good people?
And once Europeans had made that leap and made native peoples less than them, less than human, not only could they steal from them without guilt, they could also kill them without thought. In 1755, for instance, Spencer Phipps, the lieutenant governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, signed a proclamation declaring war on the native people of Maine and putting bounties on their heads, 40 pounds for a man's scalp, 20 pounds for a woman or a child.
I personally don't know of any other country or any other sovereignty who has declared war on a people that included the taking of prisoners and the killing of women and children. And so I ask, who is the savage here? I mean, these were Christian people. It states down here that by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, God save the King. Now, these are Christian people. The same people who came over here and converted the native people, yet they're declaring war on women and children.
And how do you disconnect from that? As a Penobscot person, how can you ever not know that there were bounties on your ancestor's head? How do you not have that be personalized?
Obviously, today we think of all this as horrific. How could people back then be so inhumane? But if we think this is all in the past, we need to think again. The dehumanizing of native peoples continues today, just in more subtle ways. It starts with stereotyping, which keeps us from seeing someone as a person.
A lot of the children have this mindset that we still live in wigwams or teepees, and we hunt for our food and so forth, because this is what they see on TV, this is what they read in the books and so forth.
One of the stereotypes that's really prevalent out there is that we all think alike, we all move the same way, and have the same opinions, which is very untrue.
And it's very, very confusing. What is it to be an Indian in the 21st century?
Maureen Smith's father was Oneida. Her mother was white.
My mother was very, and people always think this is very strange, but she was very biased and very full of stereotypes. She had all these stereotypes about why her kids did things. We never got lost because we were Indian. My brother could walk across ice and not fall down because we were in. She had all these things attributed to our Indianness. So you're constantly being evaluated on things that have nothing to do with who you are. I'm not a stereotype. And if people expect me to be wise or ecological or stoic or spiritual or a drunken squaw, it doesn't matter. I can't be any of those things. I am me.
Well, I mean, the racism just continues and continues. Somehow, the cookie doesn't cut both ways. I mean, it's just over and over again. We're the ones who bear the brunt.
It's the blaming the victim kind of mentality. If they just worked harder, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, didn't focus so much on the negative, got themselves out and got an education, wouldn't be so lazy, took better care of their homes, raised their children properly. I mean, I don't even want to say more. Those words are offensive to even hear.
Where do we white people stand today? Most of us pretend that everything is okay, that there is no racial injustice. If we think about it at all, we think assimilation is a solution to this question of what to do about the Indians. What to do about the Indians? We don't want them to be Indians at all. We are satisfied with continuing to kill them, both culturally and physically. We pretend there is no problem.
I feel like discrimination and racism is still here today, but they're just being discreet about it.
And a denial that there is any prejudice in anyone's heart. We don't have a problem with racism in Maine. We're all white here.
Denial. And the biggest denial is about white privilege.
Well, you know, people get really upset when you say white privilege because privilege implies money, wealth, power, all those kinds of things. And most people say, well, that's not me. You know, I had to work my way through school and all these kinds of things. But what privilege is it is kind of it's not having to think about your race. Nobody's going to generalize it to my race. So race becomes a non-issue. And so that's part of what white privilege is about.
A lot of times people will say, well, it wasn't me, it wasn't my father, it wasn't my mother. But at some point back, generations and generations ago, it was somebody's family.
They are not here right now, those who perpetrated wrongs overtly in days past. But they're my ancestors. In the same way as I've inherited their privilege, I've inherited the responsibility to make it right.
Well, of course, to the extent that it still requires the dispossession of First Nations in North, Central, and South America, then we still have to consider that the necessary thing to do is to deny that they are the legal inheritors of the people who originally owned the property when Columbus showed up. That the quality of their life has been stolen, has been purchased at the cost of taking the quality of life away from First Nations people by expropriating our property, by expropriating our resources. Collective indifference is the best description of that. That's kind of how it's happening today. When you don't understand that genocide happened in the first place, then you can do it over and over again. I was told by a United Church official that they don't like to use the word genocide because they don't believe that their parishioners could handle it. Now, what kind of an attitude is that?
Well, I think it's not only acknowledging it, but it's also accepting that, you know, there are still Native people here today. I mean, there's a long history of United States trying to eliminate, do away with Native people in this country, and in the state of Maine as well.
At one time, the Supreme Court of Maine justified government control of Native people because of their so-called imbecility. This allowed, quote, their subjection to our paternal control in disregard of some, at least, of abstract principles of the rights of man, close quote. Native people, the court was saying, were imbeciles. And these imbeciles didn't have real human rights, merely abstract ones that they could disregard.
Yeah, there's a sense of unacceptance of who we might be, and more of wanting us to be more like them, yeah. But never the words, never the dialogue.
I'm sure there were a lot of well-intentioned people who thought that they knew what was best for Indian people. And I think that continues today. What is best for Indian people? And we will make those decisions because somehow we as white people are superior.
And that's another arrogance of racism, and that goes back to the assimilation. One cannot believe that one has to change another people unless one has the arrogance to believe that one's own way is better.
I don't doubt the sincerity of a lot of the people who are engaged in various ways in the task, but nobody questioned what it was that they were doing, or they took their own ideological position as beyond doubt and never examined the basis of what they were doing. So what we get in Canada, what you get in the United States, is a great deal of emphasis on assimilating First Nations populations into the mainstream. But the assimilation is so that they will play by our rules. They will take our authority as the proper authority. They will behave like everybody else. And when they do, we've won. They say that it's a policy of that we're trying to, embrace our red brothers and sisters in the American way or the Canadian way or whatever. But that's a one-sided embrace. It's one of those crushing embraces that actually breaks every bone in your body. We're not entitled to behave as First Nations people.
My grandmother went to an Indian boarding school, and in those schools they were basically forced to not speak their language. They were really, the Indian part of them was beat out of them. And that affects me today. I mean, it doesn't stop with what happened to my grandmother. I mean, it affects how my father saw the world. It affects how I see the world. And so those policies and those things that have happened don't end. They don't end when the situation ends. They don't end when individuals die. They continue on, and then you constantly are trying to figure out, what does it mean to be an Indian? I used to apologize. I would say, I'm sorry, I don't speak my language. I'm not a full blood. I don't follow the traditions. I grew up in an urban setting, and I used to seriously apologize for all of that. And when I was standing in that cemetery and looked at all those graves, and I saw children who were 6 years old from tribes throughout the United States who had died in Lawrence, Kansas, buried at the Haskell Cemetery, I realized that to blame myself for those things would be like blaming those children for being buried where they were.
This stereotyping leads us into thinking of Native people as lazy, dirty, and drunk. It allows our racism to continue today. And once we have excluded someone from our notion of humanity, it is easy to deny him a job, or burn her business, or harass him at the border, or any of these insults and inhumanities that seem so small to us and are so easy for us to ignore. After all, we think, Native people don't deserve what few things they do have. And we resent the very few economic or educational chances that come their way. Native people are excluded from political and economic power and participation within the system they are forced to live with. And this exclusion is deep. It's built right into the system. The state and federal governments refuse to honor the treaties they have signed, and these same governments, supported by their courts, ignore the tribe's sovereignty. As one man said to me, we are denied the right to exist as a people as we see fit. And sometimes this denial is very basic, being denied the right even to live. Environmental racism is the willingness to let people of a different race suffer and die from degrading the environment. It is easier to pollute the homes of the powerless than the homes of those to whom politicians pay attention. But environmental racism goes beyond political expediency. It also means that people grow sick and die because of who they are. And often, even when the deadly effects of pollution are pointed out, we ignore the implications. And because we do nothing, people continue to die. This begins to have the stink of genocide.
For our tribe in particular, the Penobscot have had 7 paper mills that are upstream and downstream from us that have, within the past 50 years been emitting dioxin. It was the EPA report that told us that dioxin is the most lethal cancer-causing carcinogen they had ever researched. So that given that Penobscots have sustained on the fish historically, and that the river has been polluted so dramatically by the 7 pulp and paper mills, that Native people, Penobscots here, are disproportionately affected by the pollution.
For example, the incidence of cancer on Indian Island, the home of the Penobscot Nation, is much higher than in the state of Maine overall. The tribe has gone to the U.S. EPA and to the Maine state government to voice their concerns, but to no effect.
And they treated us just like we didn't exist. The Indians didn't matter. They were just invisible. And we don't listen to the invisible people.
What's, clearly apparent is the continuation of the termination policy. extermination policy that it once engaged in with the 1755 proclamation. I think that speaks to the racism of the process too, because it was like, you know, well, the Indians are dying, but you don't want Maine people to lose their jobs.
But the Indians are not dying out. Even after centuries of white domination, Native people are not going to be beaten. They are still here, and they are determined to flourish.
I saw a lot of work that needed to be done, and still does. There's a lot of work needs to be done here to bring the spirit of our Native back. Part of it is our language. Another part of it, to me, would be our culture.
And hundreds of years of coming from abusive situations can surely take away and pick away at someone's culture.
Some of these old beliefs, some of the old ways still were maintained, probably not openly, but they were still practiced.
That I've learned that I see the world really differently, and that even as much as I might try to assimilate, I really can't, because there's just something, I mean, culture, and I think the schools really showed this, culture isn't names, it isn't what you wear, it isn't what you create, it is really how you see the world. And I know that who I am, I believe, is who the Creator wanted me to be, and that I can't be anything else.
And that we want you to accept us and treat us like we are, contemporary Native Americans living in your society, going to your schools, you know, obeying the same laws, serving in the same military, working beside you in the same factory or the same business, going to the same colleges. The only difference is our heritage.
I think that it's saved. I think if we were to have become extinct, it would have happened long before now, and we're here to stay. The Creator put us here, and I think there's a determination and just a natural inevitability that we're going to be here.
And it's just, we just have to keep plugging away, keep educating, try to be vocal when the time is right, rather than, you know, being quiet and not really approaching the issues head on.
My name is Angela Staples. I am half Micmac, and I was born in Bangor. I grew up 10 minutes outside of here, and I've been living in Portland for the past 4 years. I was put in almost immediately after birth, like within a week.
Probably right around 1995, I heard that Harry had a granddaughter living here in the Bangor area. She would be my great-niece. Angela would be my great-niece. She would be the granddaughter of my brother Harry. Harry was 8 years older than I was, and I don't think I have any expectation until the meeting. I just, the excitement of it all, just to finally get to meet her, you know, get to see her, and you know, give her a big hug, and you know, let her know that she does have family.
Very exciting. Yeah. You look just like I thought you would.
We've sent some letters back and forth. She wrote me a couple of years ago, probably a year and a half ago, and asking if I could help find her mother, or find the history of her mother.
And he turned right around and wrote me right back and sent me, like, you know, the family tree and some pictures, and just, we've been writing since then. That was about like 7 or 8 months ago.
In one of her letters, she told me that she was quite tall, and she had dark hair. I could only confirm that by thinking back and looking at her grandmother, Rita Young. I believe it's just something that she needs to do to fill the gap in her life She knows there's a void, you know, and I believe that, you know, she's just trying to fill that void with family.
I was pretty nervous, but I didn't really have expectations. I think that really I just wanted to kind of, I don't know, close that gap. And well, I think it's just, awkward at first. You know, we had no idea. I mean, I know I have a million questions for him and I can't think of any of them, but I think that it'll come in time. It'll be okay. And it seems like it's just the beginning.
Step by step, some of us move forward. But where do we, as white people, go from here? This is a tough question.
I don't know if it ever can be fixed. I think maybe it will one day, but I think it's a long time away because we've been a long time getting as far as we have now, and there's still a lot there.
The first place a person needs to start in order to look at their own racism is that they need to acknowledge that they have some first.
It's impossible to heal something that isn't there. It's impossible to resolve an injustice that you refuse to acknowledge. And it's impossible to address an isolation or fragmentation in society that you think is not existing.
So I think that it has to start with understanding what it does mean to be white in this country, which means understanding some of the horrible things that have been done to people of color.
Acknowledging present-day racism is a start. But more than this, we need to see how deeply it runs in our white culture. It's not just in our attitudes, but also in how we live. This is white privilege, and we must acknowledge it.
So it becomes an issue of not how to get rid of white privilege because you can't, but how do I use my white privilege to be that ally? How do I use my position in society to be that ally, to be that voice?
This will not be easy. One man said to me, if you're going to start to communicate, you're in for an education. Don't expect to be well received.
Trying to bridge that gap of understanding. And I think that's the key word of understanding. And through education, and many of us do it, and have been doing it a long time.
One way to build a bridge is simply to create a group of people who will enter into or invite a community to enter into a dialogue, rather than to say, what is it you need? Which is a patronizing form of a question. What can we do for you? Is a condescending way to build a bridge.
But ending racism is more than goodwill and bridges. Building bridges may bring some understanding, but it doesn't acknowledge Native rights. It doesn't change policies. It doesn't give back what was stolen. Racism is more than just behaving badly. It is deeply embedded in American culture and extends back beyond 1492. It is the foundation of this country's wealth. So ending racism calls for fundamental changes. Changes in government policies, changes in the way we live, maybe even changes in the way we see the world. And though we may not yet know how, we will have to be the ones to make these changes.
It's a very common practice, but one tends to want to just leave it at, oh, this is individual, and if we just go out and address all the individuals in North America, we won't have racism. Well, it's not as simple as that, and I think people need to understand very deeply those reasons for the racism.
Let me put it another way. I've met lots of people, parishioners and even some lower level church functionaries or whatever, whose sincerity I don't doubt at all, who really want to do something, but who are not versed in the notion of criticizing their own ideological presumptions. And so consequently, they almost immediately jump to some sort of a program of action that, when you strip it down to its bare essentials, it's the oppression all over again. If you're going to make a change, we have to ultimately require it of ourselves in our material existence.
But the outcome, the final outcome is really coming to a place where, as a person, you know what your race has been through. You know what your race has done. But you are able to live with that. But to really understand it and to begin to then be able to think about how do we make it better. But how do we make it better? Kind of that whole human race make it better. Not me, not one group, but as a human race, how do we make it better?
Racism is not about Native people. It is about white people and white society. It is about us. And changing it has to start with us, looking within ourselves and facing what we see. We need to look at our culture, at our country, at our values. We need to find the racism built into our society. And then we have to change that too.
Dog me go get mo quiet.